Hey, Chandler Bolt here. Joining me today is Brooke Siem. I'm gonna try to list all these things, but I'm gonna be quick. She's the author of multiple books. It really kind of decorated, interesting, diverse bio. So, author of multiple books. Her most recent book, May Call Side Effects, Memoir. We'll talk about that on the episode today. She also is a co-author on a book called Prohibition Bakery, a baking cookbook. So she got kind of multiple publishing experiences. She's a speaker. She has created multiple businesses. She travels around the world speaking on her experience after being 6 years off of antidepressants, getting prescribed in her teenage years. Really interesting story, and is a chef specializing in custom meal planning for pro athletes. I'm like, so I got a lot of questions or a lot of stuff. I figure today we'll talk a lot about the memoir writing process. I think that's what a lot of folks listening or watching is going to be interested in. How do you take life experience, create a compelling memoir, and then use that to really create a brand, speak like all the things that you've done, Brooke. And so I think it's going to be really interesting. Brooke, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Chandler. You've just explained why I'm effectively categorically unhireable by companies.
I tell you what, I've been called a lot worse. So, oh man. Well, hey, let's start here. Why'd you decide to write a book about your life experience and what seems like, I haven't read the book yet, but it seems like some pretty tough life experiences, which is often urges people to write a book, but then often people are like, wow, am I really going to write about this? How did you decide to do that? How did you see it fitting in with kind of your brand, your business, what you're doing?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the fallacies about memoir is that typically if you're writing about your whole life experience, if you're 30, how old was I? 31 when I started writing it, you haven't really lived enough to rationalize a memoir. But the exception to that rule is if you have a very specific life experience that could somehow speak to a wide group of people, which was the case for me. My book, May Cause Side Effects, really only spans about 1 year in time. And so the other rest of my life is categorically irrelevant for this book. But I was medicated when I was 15. I was put on a cocktail of antidepressants and then a bunch of other drugs to counter the side effects of those antidepressants when I was 15 after my father died. And I didn't question anything there. Nobody did. And I spent the next 15 years on that cocktail of drugs. But basically, I wasn't better. If anything, I was worse. And it took a long time, but it started to dawn on me that I shouldn't be depressed and suicidal if I was taking antidepressants that were working. And that thought and the fact that I got this weird opportunity to travel the world for a year pushed me to go see a psychiatrist. And I told her what the deal was, and she pulled me off one of my drugs cold turkey, which was incredibly irresponsible. And it led to severe antidepressant withdrawal. I was on the lowest dose of one drug on the market. So that's why she pulled me off cold turkey. That's an important caveat. So she thought she was doing the right thing. But my story ended up being more or less like I was on the lowest dose of one of these drugs. And also I had a year going into 2 years of antidepressant withdrawal so horrific. I got a book deal out of it. That tells you something. So that's what my memoir is about. It is about the experience of going through antidepressant withdrawal, working through it. It is designed for patients, caregivers, and doctors. It's written from a very specific perspective that allows you to be right in the story as it's happening. So it gives an idea of what antidepressant withdrawal is like to the extent that you can. It's not a pop science book. It's not filled with data. It's not about that. The idea was that if someone was going through it or you were caring or treating someone who was going through it, you would be able to better recognize this through my work and stop misdiagnosing people, which is really common, and also to just have a fuller idea of what this syndrome is like, because it is something that affects a huge percentage of people that is kind of a silent epidemic in this country and all over the world.
That's good. I like that. And I think a lesson for folks watching or listening is zooming into specific parts of your life experience. Because unless you're famous, a celebrity, etc., if some people want to write a memoir, it's like, who cares?
Yeah.
how can you make it specific and helpful for people? And so I love that you did that. And so kind of to your point, even at 31, hey, I can write about my life story in a way that's going to be helpful and meaningful
Hmm.
for people. Where did you had you already been speaking about that prior to the book? Was the book kind of the first way where you said, hey, I'm going to start talking about this? What did that look like?
When I first started writing the book, I had the naive assumption based on my experience with the Prohibition Bakery book, because I am a chef by trade. So I had been through a traditional publisher before. It was a bigger publisher. And quite frankly, the process was very easy. Someone came to us and was like, "We want to publish your book," and we said, "Okay." And then a book happened. Like, it, there was no strife about it.
Wow.
There wasn't a horrible,
Very unusual.
yes, there was not. Well, it wasn't. We didn't make crap tons of money off of it, but it was just such an easy door to walk through. We didn't have to deal with trying to pitch to multiple agents or publishers or any of that. Like, an agent showed up and then she's like, "Here you go," and we were done. So I naively thought with my memoir that it would be more or less the same process, that all I had to do was have an interesting story and write decent proposal or something, and that it would just be easy. It wasn't. There was a lot that happened. I ended up firing my agent. We killed the deal, and then 4 years passed between finding another agent and getting another deal. So it was quite dramatic. But as I was writing it, and I knew that it would probably come out eventually, combined with the fact that I started to see the cultural temperature around this topic change, I knew that someone was gonna tell this story. It may as well be me. And so I started quietly speaking on it. I literally had a couple small public speaking opportunities, kind of slam poet type things where you just stand up in a bar and tell your story. That was pretty terrifying, even though there were only 15 people in the room. And then I wrote a couple of articles for major media outlets, and it was just kind of like a slow creep into it, where I was testing the waters to see how comfortable I felt about talking about the topic, what the feedback would be like, because it's kind of controversial, which is stupid, but it is. So I didn't know how comfortable I was going to feel kind of going into the line of fire. But then once the book came out and it actually went global and really nothing bad has happened, now I'm just kind of like took all the took all the shackles off, and I'm just going forward and saying what I think is right about this and dealing with the blowback one way or another. But it's actually not that bad, because I think people are really starting to wake up to the idea that what we're doing isn't working very well. So maybe we do need to be talking about this.
Mm, yeah, I love that and completely agree. So so you had an agent, you said it sounds like had a deal, that deal kind of blew up, you decided to fire him, then
Hmm.
shopped it around, found another. What's the backstory around all that? Did you at any point in that consider self-publishing? How did you make your way back to what sounds
Yeah.
like a deal? Like, what did that look like?
I did not consider self-publishing at any point during this process for a very specific reason. And that's just because I am not a researcher or a PhD on this topic. So I knew that if this was going to be taken seriously, it needed to have the backing of a legitimate traditional publisher. That has proved to be a very, very smart decision. And I, however, now I'm looking into getting the book translated and self-publishing in other countries, because now it's fine, right? I am established as a recognized expert or whatever you want to call it in this industry. So it's like actually would be easier for me to self-publish a book now than it would have been when it came out. But the earlier process, I mean, I'm still kind of almost like embarrassed about this, but I'm going to share it because hopefully somebody else won't have to go through it. But I had an agent who was left over from a different time in my life, and she had gotten a deal with what I now know is a hybrid slash vanity press, but I didn't really understand that at the time. It was right when those things were kind of new. So they were still kind of billing themselves as, "Oh, we'll take half we're going to give you 50% payout on the royalties." And it sounded like such a good deal. And, then I didn't have to pay out the advance. I mean, there were all these things that seemed really good about it. And I know that there are a couple more reputable hybrid publishers out there now. This was not one of them, and those ones did not exist at this time. So this one ended up really being more vanity and borderline predatory. And I knew that that was the case because there was a I got sent a galley of another book that these people were publishing, and their editor dropped the ball, which was red flag number one. And so they wanted me to just look it over and see if I could point out any typos, red flag number two. And I looked at it, and literally there was a major typo in the dedication on the first page. And I was like, this is not a good sign. And then I kept reading through it. I got about, 25 pages in, and there were so many errors. And this book was like pulled from going into production. So there were so many errors in 25 pages. I lost count, and I was like, no one here is doing a quality control check or job. So I just realized that there had been a bit of a dupe that had happened, and that somehow this crappy agent was in collusion with them, and they were just kind of trying to make money. And again, this all kind of happened. This all came around from the back end and surprised me. It actually started off legit, and it took the turn of predatory halfway through the process, which is why I didn't see what was going on. And in the end, I fired everyone, and then this agent ended up fleeing the state in her Winnebago with her two dogs. There are multiple of her authors that she stole a bunch of royalties from, including me. And that has been just an ongoing weird twist from this
Whoa.
over the course of like the past
That's
7 to 8
wild.
years, where I'm just like, well, yeah, this is how we learn, I guess. It's a good thing
Yeah.
I didn't lose a significant amount of money, but there were a lot of bad actors in this space.
Agreed. Agreed. And I appreciate you sharing that for exactly that right reason, or for exactly that reason, right? Because there's a lot of people out there that may not know that exists, and you probably just save some people some
Can
time,
I
money,
can I
time, money,
can I
and
give
heartache. Yeah,
people one really important piece of advice that I've learned from this story?
I'd love that.
When you have an agent and royalties are involved, always make sure the publisher is cutting separate checks for you and your agent based on whatever the percentage cut is. The problem is that I didn't know that at the time, and I didn't know my agent was predatory, and so the publishing company set her all the royalties directly, and then it was in our agreement that she would then cut checks to me. And she didn't do that. And I also had no clue. She was the one who was getting all the reports about how many books we'd sold and how much money we were supposed to be making. So I never saw any of that. And when I stopped receiving communication around it, I just assumed the book had stopped selling, when in reality, the checks were just being sent to someone who was taking them. So when I have my agent now, who her name's Beth Davy, I love her so much. We talked about this in the very beginning, and she was like, yeah, I never touched money from my clients. Like, the publisher will send, the 15% cut or whatever it is to her. I get the rest. It's two separate checks. That's got to be part of it. And if it's not, that should be a giant red flag to run far, far away.
Yeah, it's a really great lesson. I mean, it's more in integrity, and it's just easier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think about it, it's like, if I'm an agent, I don't want to have to deal with cutting people checks. I just want to get my check and my authors get their check.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So how did you find Beth? And then what changed and what's worked well kind of in the agent relationship with her, and then her helping you with the book?
Well, Beth is just wonderful and distinctly not a criminal. So that made the relationships much better. Just starting there. But I actually found her because I had gone through some writing retreats with Laura Munson, who's a New York Times bestselling author and runs just the most soul affirming writing retreat out of Montana. I mean, it's the kind of place where I showed up there, and for 5 days, I just thought, this is what life should be like for artists. It was beautiful. And she made the introduction to Beth because at that point I had been deep enough into my memoir writing that I had some real meat to show. And so I went to Laura's retreat. I kind of got the direction I needed to go. I spent about 3 months. I just rented an apartment in Seattle, basically holed up like a monk for 3 months, wrote out a draft that was finally strong. And ultimately, that's what got me the deal with Beth. And then Beth went out to sell the book in April of 2020, which was poor.
Which was what you said?
Which was poor because that was roughly 3 weeks into the pandemic.
Oh, I see.
That was not a time to try and sell a book about psychiatric drug withdrawal when prescriptions were being given out at record rates. So it's been clunky from start to finish, but still got there.
Well,
Still
it's
got out
landed
there.
in a great spot, obviously. So I
Yeah.
guess what was the big breakthrough at where you got the deal and then got it published?
There wasn't really a big breakthrough. It was actually kind of, I had started to transition to the mental state of like, this just isn't going to happen because the, I don't think this would have been the case had the timing not been what it was, the pandemic. But the book kept getting sent to editors, and we would get this great feedback from the editors, and then they would pass it along, and it kept getting killed in marketing or by legal. And
Uh,
that literally probably happened a dozen times. I mean, it was
okay, interesting.
so
Yeah.
frustrating. And so I, and there are a lot of threads I can pull at that to try and explain why, but I think the big thing is that at the end of the day, these big publishing houses don't really want to rock the boat.
No. They don't want to
And
take risks and they don't want to be liable for
ex-
content.
exactly. So I just kind of thought this isn't going to happen. And I really had to make, come to terms with the fact that this book just might sit in a drawer and never get read. And kind of like things happened in life. Once I really got comfortable in that place, this isn't happening. That's when the deal came through.
Hmm. So I want to fast forward to memoir marketing and kind of how this fits in with your brand and all that stuff here in just a second. But I want to maybe first backtrack into the writing piece. You mentioned the writing retreat, and then locking yourself in your apartment in Seattle and that sort of thing. Uh, can you talk about how hard or easy it was to write about this experience? And especially because we hear this all the time from our authors, writing a memoir can kind of be this cathartic experience. It's like free therapy,
hmm
really difficult. You don't know how much of it do you share, how much do you not, and even just the writing process can be pretty difficult. So can you talk about what was your experience? Was that your experience? Was it not? What did that kind of look like?
I hear that from memoirists all the time, and I don't identify with that at all. Like to me, from an experience standpoint, there wasn't anything difficult about it in the sense that like I had done so much work on the healing. I wasn't writing from the wound anymore. I was writing from the scar. I was writing from the perspective of how do I make this story effective for the reader, which I really think is the healthiest place to be writing about difficult topics. I think if you're still stuck in the drama of it can be really difficult to get objective, which you have to do as the author, which sounds a little odd because you're writing about a subjective thing that happened to you. But you have to be objective in the way you put it on the page because it's not about you, it's about how it's going to land. So the tricky part for me was mostly finding the correct tone and voice because the experience is really, really intense. And I I love books. I love reading. I spent a huge chunk of my writing time reading. Like I wasn't actually writing my book. I was studying people whose works I admired and trying to figure out, okay, how did they create this narrative arc? What about their voice sounds resonant to me? What doesn't? And most memoirs written in first person past, it's like it's in past tense. There tends to be the memoirists I really like are beautiful writers. Like there's poetry in their language, there's imagery, it's beautiful. And every time I tried to write like that in my story, it sucked. Every single time. It just like I went into this weird wise narrator place and it just sucked.
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure it out because I knew technically I knew how to write, but I'm like, why does this suck? And so
Mhm.
I I also knew the difference between this sucks and am I insecure about my writing and I just need like it
Mm.
doesn't suck, but I'm
Oh
not
wow.
sure. Like I
Yeah.
knew the difference. So I knew it sucked. And and so that's when Laura was really such a huge help for me because she was reading my work and she was like, "Okay, I need you to go write something in first person present." And I was like, "That's weird.
Oh.
I've never read a book in like a memoir in first person present tense." And she's just like, just trust me, just do it as an exercise. And I said, okay. And again, we were in Montana. It was beautiful. So it was March, snowy. Take my laptop and I put on all my clothes and I kind of trudged out to this little gazebo in the middle of this beautiful horse farm in Montana. And I just sat there freezing. And I can't remember if I rewrote a scene that was already written or if I wrote something new. I think it was almost entirely new. And it was about 1,500 words. It was all in first person present. I solved a huge problem in the narrative, which was I was trying to give the backstory without spending too much time on the backstory. Because if you look at most memoirs, like you're in the thick of whatever's going on within the first 10 pages, but that might require you to give 30 years of backstory. How do you do that, right? But somehow switching into first person present, I started working back through time over this 1,500 words. And I was like, basically, this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened in this completely different tone than I've ever written in. And it came out of me and I was like, oh shit, this is good. And then I was like, but is it? And then I read it to Laura and she was like, you wrote that today? And I said, uh-huh. And she was just kind of like, that is the direction we go. So when I realized that I had the power in my voice in first person present, everything became so much easier for me to write. Good Lord. Put it on D&D and failed. So anyway, when I realized that I had power in my voice in first person present, that the whole narrative opened up. I'm not going to say it was easy for me to write still, but it was very easy for me to just be like, how did I feel in that moment? And basically write on the page, I am furious. And then whatever would come would come. And so it allowed me a way in. And then because it was a book about the psychological turmoil of antidepressant withdrawal, it allowed me to be nonsensical. I could be emotional. I could not make any quote unquote sense because I was having an experience that didn't make sense. And I couldn't do that in past tense because in past tense, it still has to make sense in a way. In first
Oh,
person present, it doesn't.
interesting. Wow, that's fascinating. I think there's a few things I want to just highlight here that were really good that you said. One is that writing from the wound versus writing from the scar. I think that's
Yeah.
a really interesting distinction that will be very helpful for a lot of
Hmm.
our authors. And you just have a high level of self-awareness, which I think probably helped navigate this. And you talked
Yes.
about kind of going
Yes.
through uh, therapy and stuff prior to that,
Hmm.
which is helpful to process so that then you have clarity when you're actually writing. I also liked you said the memoir is not about you; it's about how it's going to land and really
Yeah.
how it's going to help the reader. Really important thing for people to think about. And then lastly, I think, we have a memoir program and a nonfiction program and a fiction program and stuff like that. Um, we always say, and this really shocks people, is that our memoir training very much more closely resembles our fiction training
Hmm.
because you're writing a story that's
Yeah.
engaging. It's just so happens to be that you're the main character versus a lot of
Exactly.
nonfiction writing is very kind of bland, direct, etc. It
Yeah.
sounds like that's kind of was your experience as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many parallels between memoir and fiction, even the way they sell is similar. A nonfiction book, and let's say it's a pop science book or, some historical thing. Like it's pretty you sell it based on proposal. So your job is to write a detailed proposal, basically an outline of what's going to be in this book. And then you take it to your agent who takes it to the publisher and they look at it and they say, yes, this makes sense, or no, it doesn't, or whatever, and you move on. But there's not nearly as much scrutiny of the voice of that kind of writing. It's pretty, like you said, cut and dry for the most part. But with memoir, you're telling it your voice has to come through the page, and I don't mean just writing voice, but like you as a person has to come through the page. And so if it sounded as bland and dry as typical nonfiction, then you would have no context of the person who's telling the story, which automatically is going to mean the memoirist doesn't connect with the reader. It's similar with fiction too, right? You have to have the characters resonate with whoever's reading it. And so when you sell memoir, unless again you're a celebrity or someone who just has such a presence that they feel like they can sell it no matter what the writing's like, you have to basically have a full proposal, sorry, not proposal, a full manuscript, and that's what they judge it on. And so you really do have to think of it more like fiction, and then you have to become a huge editor of your own story. And I guess in a way where it can sort of maybe be therapizing for some people or therapeutic for some people, is if it helps you untangle the stories you tell yourself about what happened, then I
Mm.
could see with how that would help people. But for me, I
Mhm.
felt like I'd already done that. And it was very clear to me that my book was about the year I spent in antidepressant withdrawal and absolutely nothing else. To the point where I opened the book in the preface saying, you don't need to know why we're here. It is irrelevant. Like all the shit that happened in my life that contributed to my feelings of depression, it is completely irrelevant to this story. And I did that strategically. One, it really was irrelevant. The book was about antidepressant withdrawal. It wasn't about the years of depression leading up to it.
Mm-hmm.
Two, this is a topic where people can get into the suffering Olympics very quickly. And so it felt useless to me to basically create a story that's like, oh, woe is me, feel sorry for me. Like this is why I'm sick and needed this or whatever. That would just open people up to comparison.
Right.
And that wasn't the point, because whether or not you were put on antidepressants as a kid, like I was, or whether or not you were put on them because there was an event in your life, whether or not you had no event in your life and you were just felt sad, or if you lost a child, or you were put on because of menopause, like none of those reasons matter when it comes to getting off of these drugs. Everyone's in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a rocky boat with zero research. So that is what the book needed to focus on. And when I started stripping things away about my own personal reasons for it and like trying to justify it, it got much easier to write because it became clear what my North Star was.
That's good and a really good observation. Hard to do too, because
Yeah.
as a human, you're like, hey, but I'm interesting and my life experience is interesting.
Yeah,
And
but
so,
you're not, and it's not.
all right, you said it, not me. Hey, I want to talk marketing a bit.
Yeah.
So because I think this is a kind of a black box for a lot of people, is how
Yeah.
do you market a memoir and what does that look like? So how did you do it? And then especially
Okay.
how did this help build or relate to your personal brand, the speaking that you're doing, all that kind of thing?
Okay, well, Chandler, again, this is a story not of what went right, but of what went wrong. So learn from me. Okay, so the thing, there's multiple, marketing's such a big term, right? Such a big word. I think there are multiple strategies, but when you have a memoir that, I know my book was technically strong enough to compete with the best-selling memoirs on the market. I know it was technically strong enough. And I think if it was more available in the world, more well-known, it would keep selling and it would make a shit ton of money. But there is quite a hump to get to that point, because books, especially memoirs that are very well known in the world, didn't happen by accident. It wasn't just that people happened to find it and it took off. No, it was a coordinated effort starting about a year before, with the publishing companies and podcast tours, speaking tours, magazine tours, getting picked for Oprah or Reese Witherspoon's book club. Like, that seems like, oh, they just picked it a week ago. They didn't. They picked it a year ago. And everyone has been prepping for that book to be the book in that particular category. So if you don't slot into that space right away, I mean, yeah, there are a handful of rare books that can really take off, and like The Martian comes to mind, started off as a self-publishing book that took off, and Andy Weir eventually made it to be within traditional publishing houses. But for most people, that's not what happens. So then you pay out of pocket for PR people. You hope your publisher does something, or if you don't have a publisher, you figure out how to do something yourself. But I am a little biased on this in the negative way, because none of that went well for us. Like, it didn't. It was very little fruit was bared given the amount of money was spent on PR. I think there was a lot of train wrecks that happened. I watched it all happen and was powerless to do it. But a big thing is nobody started early enough. Like, I got my book deal in July of 2021. The book came out in September. I was trying to get people on board to do what they needed to do, like at least 6 months ahead of time. But everyone just said, oh, we're going to start August 1st. And I knew that wasn't going to work. I knew it wasn't going to. But I was powerless at that point because I had given away the power. And that is what happens when you go down traditional publishing routes, is you do give away a lot of the power. And I didn't have $25,000 sitting in my bank account that I was going to go hire people out of pocket myself. So I kind of had to just deal with that. And it did not go well. And I think there was a huge missed opportunity. But as far as the stuff I did myself, when I recognized that that train was not really going to leave the station, I, I got some pieces placed in traditional media, New York Post, Business Insider, God, what else? Washington Examiner, had something in the Washington Post, those kind of op-ed things you do.
Nice.
Uh, they help a little bit, but they don't help that much. I mean, for example, I had a big op-ed in the New York Post that was both print and online within a week of my book coming out. If you look at the Amazon data, it only sold 300 books. Like it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you need. I think doing that stuff is worth it, but don't expect it to launch you to a bestseller. That's going to require a lot more strategy. So for me, when I kind of realized, okay, we weren't going to have a book that was going to hit the bestseller list within, a few months after launching, and then when it became clear that this may never hit a bestseller list, and that doesn't mean the book isn't worth reading by any means. Most books aren't on bestseller lists. I just realized that, I had strategically written the book to be a perennial seller from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
There's no dates in the book. There's literally not a single date other than the last day I wrote it. I didn't want anyone to know what period of time this was taking place in, so it would continue to be relevant over time.
Yep.
So I've just taken the strategy of this is a perennial selling book. It's going to be evergreen. It's going to keep selling. So all I have to do is keep talking about it and it will keep
Yep.
selling. And there could be some sort of cultural spark that lights an absolute fire and suddenly the book blows up. But maybe not. Odds are probably no, but it's still consistently selling copies and I'm consistently getting feedback on it from readers and I'm still doing podcasts and speaking and stuff. So it will continue to chug along, but I think redefining what your success means to you is a requirement in this process.
That's a big one. It's a really big one. And I love, we call essentially what you're doing, we call it the 1 year launch, right? Where it's just, hey, I'm just going to keep talking about this for a
Yeah,
year
yeah, I'm on
instead
a
of
2-year launch now.
yeah, there you go. Instead of a week, which is how most people, the two big mistakes they make, which you alluded to, are they focus only on launch week and
Mm-hmm.
then they focus only on the bestseller list. And you can hit the bestseller list and have a good launch week and have a book that doesn't do much at all because
Yeah.
you had a good week. And so
Yeah.
building that long-term momentum in it, which obviously you're doing. Let's maybe last piece and then we can wrap up is how have you bridged this into your business and where has this showed up for speaking gigs and for anything else that
Yeah.
you're doing? Like how has it helped there?
That's a good question. And it's been a big struggle because as we alluded to my extremely confusing bio at the beginning. So I've spent my entire career, paid career, if you will, as a professional chef. So I went to culinary school, worked in fancy kitchens, owned a bakery in Manhattan, which is when the start of my book begins, is when I was working in my bakery. I competed on the show Chopped. I was in Withdrawal while I was on Chopped. And then I sort of got rid of that whole aspect of my life and started healing from this process, but I've never left the culinary industry because you get to a point where well that's what I do and that's what people pay me to do. So since I'm categorically unhireable, I need to keep doing that in order to pay my bills. So I've actually transitioned now. I work with pro athletes, and what's fascinating, and it's only in the past couple of years I've been able to bridge everything together, is that I understand how the food system works. I understand how the pharmaceutical system works and the mental health system works. And really, if you want to pull back the curtain on those things, you just swap the words pharmaceutical for ultra processed foods and big pharma for big food and so on and so forth. And it's the same playbook. And not only that, they really feed into each other. So in my work and advocacy around withdrawal, I have a lot of people whose bodies are completely wrecked. Mine was completely wrecked coming off of these drugs. And I've had to use food and my understanding of how food is
Oh,
medicine
interesting.
or a drug
Mm-hmm.
to heal. And
Yeah.
and that when I compare it directly to how I work with my pro athletes, like whether or not they're in the MLB or the NFL, I'm actually feeding them in an identical way as I would feed someone who more or less who's coming out of, severe antidepressant withdrawal and trying to heal. Because as it turns out, the foods that are actually really help us heal are kind of the same and limited and, they're not in a package and
Yeah.
they're recognizable as a whole food and then everything else is just the noise. And so in the past few years, I've actually really been able to bridge these two things together. Now, from a marketing standpoint, that is really great for people who want to listen, and who actually can think of this stuff on a bit of a higher level topic. Instagram hates it because I'm competing with two completely different algorithms. And so if I try and talk about my food work on Instagram, when I'm talking about my book work most of the time, it just dies and the whole algorithm gets confused. So I've recently decided, okay, we need to separate this stuff. And so my primary Instagram is completely about just withdrawal advocacy work. And then I have a chef Instagram that's a little bit more about like, this is how I'm cooking for my NFL players this week or whatever. But
Oh, cool.
and so that helps social media. But I do all the time wonder how they interact with each other. And I don't know if negative is the really way to put it, but because withdrawal and mental health can be so polarizing, it does make me nervous to talk about it so publicly and then try and go market myself as a chef and try and get clients. Because if I happen to run into a client or an employer who doesn't want to rock the boat, they might not want to be associated with me, and I've sort of just had to accept that as a consequence of the situation. And
No doubt.
basically like, the right people are going to come to me and the wrong ones won't. But it's a little scary. It's very scary to be so public about something that's so vulnerable and to still exist in a world that's not totally around that. Like, I don't make any money really off of my advocacy work. So it's basically like, am I shooting myself in the foot from a career standpoint by doing this? But it's to me, it's far more important than
Agreed.
the cooking stuff.
When I think on a long enough timeline, it's a big magnet. It repels the people who wouldn't like you or want to work with you anyway, or vice versa, that you wouldn't want to work with, and it attracts the people who would and who resonate with that, which is I think is a super smart move. Well, I'll ask these last question or two, Brooke. Question one would be, what would your advice be, knowing what you know now, to someone who's listening to this, thinking about writing a memoir, knowing what you know now?
I think I think as anyone who has any desire to write a memoir should give it a shot. And also, there's no shame in saying that was a good idea, but maybe we're not going to fully go through with it. Like, I do really, it's not that I'm trying to discourage anyone. It's just that, like, you have to know why you're doing it. If you're writing a book for a purpose, you're writing a cause-based book, then you have to write a cause-based book. You can't, and you have to take all the crap that comes with that. If you want to write a memoir because you want to put your story out into the world and you want to self-publish it, and you're doing it for you, then write that book, but try not to get the two confused. I get really frustrated with that sometimes, just because it's like we've said, I mean, it's kind of like when someone's trying to explain your dreams. Like, most people don't want to hear about other people's dreams. Like, it's just not that interesting. Or drug trips, whatever it is, right? It's just not that interesting to anyone except for you. And I'm not trying to say that my work is like so interesting everyone should read it. I'm actually trying to say the opposite, is that most of my life is completely not worth putting on paper and expecting other people to be interested in it, right? So just get clear on that. And the sooner you can get clear on that, the easier the process is going to be. Because again, this is completely about managing expectations. And if your expectation is that if you're making art for the sake of making art, like, I love that, right? I love Kurt Vonnegut said, make bad art, because it's like what makes for better people. I make bad art all the time. It's the primary thing I do in my life, is make bad art that nobody ever sees, or that only a handful of people see, because it brings me joy. But that does not mean I've decided that that's how I'm going to make my money and go into this whole career off of that. Now, and if you're doing a cause-based book, there are more options for career and for it to be something that really becomes a big thing in your life. But it's tricky, it's difficult, and I make $1.06 for every book I sell. So just manage your expectations there.
Yeah, it's good. Brooke, it's been awesome. Where can people go to find out more about you, to buy your book, all that good stuff?
You can find me all over the internet at Brooke Siem. So that's BROOKESIEM. Although my chef Instagram is at Chef Brooke Siem. And I have a newsletter called Happiness is a Skill. That's Brooke Siem at substack.com. So we talk I get a lot more in the weeds about antidepressant withdrawal and health and recovery there than I do on social media. And what was the other question?
The book. It's called
Oh,
May
the book.
Cause
You can,
Side
yeah,
Effects.
yes, you can find May Cause Side Effects wherever fine books are sold. So it's all over Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever. You can get it in other countries, but it's not quite as easy there. I'm kind of working on translations. We'll see how that goes. And it's on audiobook, etc. It's wherever you get books, you can find my book.
Love it. Guys, check it out. May Cause Side Effects. Brooke, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandler.